We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that you really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Trying to be objective, doing our best to be objective about all of these different talking points or subjects. How do you feel going into, let's say, the next 3 weeks and into the end of the year, now that the Fed has done the first rate cut, and obviously reading as widely as you do, you've seen this idea that the crash comes after the first rate cuts, and sitting at these pretty much all-time highs. Yeah.
I'm staggered by the ignorance of people who should know better. So people who say, oh, it's great, the market's really going to rock when the Fed starts cutting the rates. And you go, why don't you take a peek at the last couple of times the Fed cut rates and look what happened? From the day that the Fed started cutting rates, that marked the top. And looking forward to, 50, 60% sort of level corrections. So this idea, people say, gold does poorly when the Fed's hiking rates. And I go, you don't remember the 70s? You don't remember that maybe the Fed's hiking rates in response to inflation, and the gold's going up in response to inflation, and therefore Fed hiking rates and gold might correlate with each other, right? So and then you look at the inflation numbers and people cite inflation's 2.5, and I go, you got to get out more. If you really believe that, you got your head up your ass, right? And then you dig into how they calculate inflation, and it's just batshit crazy adjustments from head to toe, whether it's hedonic adjustments for more buttons, or whether it's substitution, or whether it's excluding everything that goes up. Whether it's I'm going to write a big attack on inflation again this year, and I blame economists because they get into all their equations and stuff, and I go, you're losing sight of the fact that the prices are going up. You somehow haven't noticed that the prices are going up. And so I find it appalling how ignorant the wonks are. I have found, for example, that people don't understand market valuation. And so, I've predicted, I'm on record, boy, am I on record for this one. I think we have a 40-year bear market coming. Now, that's not to say it's going to go down for 40 years. What it is to say is just that based on current valuations, based on the assumption that GDP will grow fairly normally, and based on the assumption that somehow 40 years from now, we will have regressed to the mean, it is fourth grade arithmetic to predict the markets can't go anywhere. Because if we're 150% overvalued, and I've got 25 metrics that say so, but the easiest is maybe the Case-Shiller PE. Whereas from 1880 to 1994-ish, it just wobbled around 12. That's the mean. And you say, that's not fair value. I realize fair value is the wrong term. That's historical average value. What's fair is a judgment call, right? I don't think it's fair or unfair. It is what it is. So for what is it? 110 years, valuation just wiggle. Valuation should not trend because it's the price of the revenue stream that you got. And if it's going to trend, then something else has to trend with it. So, for example, if the valuations double, let's say it takes some stock has a PE of 100. Well, that stock is priced to return 1%. And most people can't grasp that. I go, if you bought a bond that had a 1% return, you'd know what that means. Well, you're buying a stock with a 1% return. What's so hard about this? Then people will talk about, well, it's a growth company. I go, okay, let's go with that one. So it's price at a return of 1%, and you're assuming you're going to get 12% off your portfolio. So let's notice there's a factor of 12 gap here right now. You say, but it's a growth company. It's NVIDIA, and NVIDIA is going to save the world, right? Or whatever. You go, okay, so let's say it doubles its earnings. which is a pretty bold move for one of these Mag 7 types. You go, okay, so now it'll have a PE of 50, which means it's priced for 2% return. And say, well, let's say it doubles its return again. Well, now it's priced for a 4% return. Let's say they double again. Well, now it's priced for an 8% return. You've regressed to what is a historical expectation. Now, the real expectation is about 4%, inflation adjusted. That's a Graham Dodd Buffett. You can't get more than about 4% over the infinite time, ignoring valuation changes. And but people don't understand this. And so they say, well, but they're debasing the dollar. And I go, well, you price earnings, that earnings thing, that's getting debased too. So that's stupid. So the fact of the matter is you're going to have to double your earnings and double them again, and then you're going to be priced at a level that you'd say, oh, I'll accept that return. And if that's a return you want, just buy a goddamn tobacco stock. I just looked this morning. Philip Morris has got a 9% dividend. They also have a ton of debt. You know why they have a ton of debt? It's a toxic bank account to keep someone from groping for them. The debt. Cornell once lost some research trees because a couple of kids cut them down for Christmas trees. And so they invented this spray you could spray on the tree that would eventually wash away, but made the tree really ugly. So you could spray your research trees and they wouldn't get cut down by fraternity guys. And so the debt on the balance sheet of Philip Morris is to keep it from looking like a honeypot that someone could go for and say, look at those evil tobacco guys. Look at all that money in the bank. Let's go get that. They go, no, we've got debt. Mm-hmm. And so
I guess it depends on
the money just flows out as a 9% dividend year after year after year. I've owned them for a long time and it just flows out of there.
I guess it also depends on how that debt is structured too.
Right. So I am hoping that these guys who've figured out how to run a tobacco company without destroying themselves were smart enough to throw their debt long term. Mm. So as rates went up, their carrying costs of that debt didn't go up, because if they had long-term debt, 30-year bond at 2% or whatever it was, they can carry that debt for eternity. Exactly. That's easy. And now rates will go back down and then they'll throw it back out again. So people don't understand valuations. And I've noticed in my podcast where I predict this 40-year bear market, which again is arithmetic, because if you're 100% overvalued, if you grow at 2.5% a year, which is what the GDP grows at, if you believe it. Now, I've got an alternative interpretation of that too, which is darker. It will take you 40 years for the GDP to slowly grow its way into the valuation of your market. So either the market's got to come down to meet it, or the GDP's got to slowly grow up to meet it, or some combination of the two. Mm-hmm. That's right. Now, there's, to me, far scarier than a price correction is duration risk. So in 1967 to 81, the markets treaded water for 14 years. Inflation adjusted, they lost 70%. Now imagine a boomer now, if you told them, look, your nest egg, which you just retired on, in 14 years, you're going to be probably 80 years old, will have lost 70%. How are you going to do? And the answer is most of them would say, I would die of starvation.
Even if you don't spend a penny of it over that time. That's
right. And once you start spending it, now you're now you start eating your seed corn, right? To use a simple metaphor. And so and inflation's horrid. Inflation is, ask anyone who buys something, inflation is not 2.5%. Mm-hmm. That's a fictional number. And it's fictional, and you can actually point to the reasons it's fictional and how they do it and the mechanics of their fictionality. They just make shit up. Here's one. Owner equivalent rent. So they say, how much is housing going up? Okay, good question. Well, first of all, the question is how much is the house going up, but also the cost of buying a house going up. So it's a complicated question. What do? They skip that whole thing. they survey people, which I've never been asked, I should add, how much could you rent your house for? And they use that as a metric for the value of your house. Now, how many people, what percentage of the population do you think could actually give a coherent answer to how much their house could be rented for? And unless you're running an Airbnb, you don't know.
And hopefully that Airbnb isn't in Florida.
Yeah. Well, it won't be an Airbnb for long, that's for sure. Florida's getting, it looks like Iraq at day one in terms of the red spots where all the houses being sold are showing up. Substitutions are a real gem that I finally figured out. So the hedonic adjustments, they say that the items are better now than they used to be, and therefore we're going to say that they're actually cheaper, when in fact I would make the argument that the stuff we buy from the store is a piece of crap. So if you bought a blender from 1940, it still runs. You buy a blender from 1990, it certainly does not run. And so we just put a 70-year-old refrigerator out to pasture. It still ran, but the gaskets were starting to go and stuff. But there will not be a 70-year-old fridge 70 years from now.
No.
And so the quality of goods has gone way down. The cost of replacing a piece of plastic that broke in your car requires replacing a whole unit of something. And so the cost of repair is way up. Healthcare is going to go into our GDP. That's an entertaining one. So our GDP is going to have healthcare in it. So what does that mean? So healthcare is not GDP. That's my assertion. It is not GDP. And how do you know? Let's say you had a population that needed no health care. They're healthy. Are they better off or worse? They're better. So you're not producing anything. The healthcare costs represent the cost of keeping a rapidly depreciating asset from breaking.
That's a good.
So if you had a 20-year-old Chevette and it was in the shop every other day, just to keep it on the road, is that GDP? And the answer is no. Mm-hmm. So if you had a car that never needed repairing, that's not product. So the fact that healthcare is a huge percentage of our GDP just means that we've got this rapidly. So that's back to the idea of a rapidly depreciating washing machine, blender, body, the boomers.
Planned obsolescence. Yeah.
Boomers are planned obsolescence. And then you've got the one called substitution. They go, okay, let's fudge that one. So substitution is where you go to the store and you would have bought sirloin, but instead you buy chicken. Therefore, it didn't actually cost you as much as you thought because you replaced sirloin with chicken. And I used to joke about, well, then we're going to eat worms and grubs and there'll be no inflation at all, right? But here's a more interesting angle. Let's flip it. If the steak costs twice as much and you substitute with chicken to save money, should you not? The free market is telling you the steak is twice as good as the chicken. Price is twice as good. You can fight with the free market if you want, but I'm not going to. Does that not mean that your substitution should be precisely offset by a hedonic adjustment for the reduction in quality? And therefore, there should be no substitution. Mm-hmm. You're accepting an inferior product that should be hedonically adjusted for precisely that amount.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So substitution's idiocy.
Mm-hmm. How much of this, let's say this cheap money era, this artificial cost of money era, mixes these signals that we should be getting from the quote unquote free market? I find the free market argument nowadays to be really difficult to make.
Yeah. That reminds
like taking the bond market.
My response is that's a rhetorical question, isn't it? I used to like to watch Jimmy Rogers. He'd be interviewed and someone would throw him a lob pitch. Jimmy, what's the state of the economy? Mm-hmm. He'd say, look at it, everything's collapsed. What kind of dumb question is that? And I'm going, Jimmy. They're really just trying to tee you up to talk. They know it. Don't pick on them. Don't pick on your host because they asked a question that to you sounds obvious. They're letting you tell the audience why it's obvious, right? yeah, the signals are a mess, right? So, price is a critical signal. And I was on a podcast the other day and I said, the Fed's in the business of displacing systems from equilibrium. So there's this miraculous dance that the free market does, which I think is extraordinary, actually. Take, for example, Manhattan. Every day, Manhattan probably feeds, 5 million people. Pizza, fancy restaurant, you name it, but 5 million people. There is no food oversight board. There is no central nervous system to this. It is this magical dance where somehow the people who supply the food and the people who buy the food know what price to charge, how much to put in that morning by that truck that showed up at 6 a.m. It's this unbelievable example of the market just equilibrating. Mm-hmm. And if something's gone wrong, like the economy's slowing down, it corrects. They go, okay, we shouldn't put in as much food because we're not getting as many pizzas being sold now. And the Fed takes the most important market in the world, the central market to capitalism, the price of money, and says, you guys aren't smart enough to set that. We'll set that. Mm-hmm. We're going to set that because we're a committee of 12 elders with PhDs, all from Chicago. and if all of a sudden we decide that the marketplace is setting the price of money wrong, well, we're going to change that because we know better. What a bunch of clowns, right? The Russians used to set prices in Russia. It didn't work. It didn't work for two reasons. One is obviously it would fail, but they were actually kind of cute about it. They used to look to the United States and the West and say, what do potatoes cost over there? We'll set them. So they were imitating us. Mm-hmm. But what they failed to recognize was, but that doesn't mean that's what a potato should cost in Russia. And so it just didn't work. And so you really, if the Fed set the interest rates at 5% and never touched them again, we'd be fine. The free market would find a way to work around it, say, okay, mm-hmm. It's this Rock of Gibraltar basic rate. And if inflation's doing this, we'll do this, we'll hedge this way. The free market will figure it out. Mm-hmm. But they don't. Just when you think you figured out, they throw the system out of equilibrium. They say, oh, we're going to drop the rates 50 basis points. Now, for several years now, I've been on economic panels with famous people and disagreed with these famous economists. Guys like Jim Stack and Peter Bookvar, and really guys who are just, I shouldn't be allowed to even take out the trash, right? But I've disagreed with them. And they've talked about how the Fed's going to do this and this and this, and it was always about easing when needed. And I said, I think you're underestimating Powell. Now, he did drop 50 basis points, but I'll explain it in a second. I said, I think you're underestimating Powell because he's not just a central banker. I think your assumption he has allegiance to the administration is probably wrong, because if I were the Fed and I were trying to straighten out a mess, I'd be pissed off at Biden right now because he's been spending money like a drunken sailor. And they're trying to somehow reel in the system and kind of tap the brakes a little bit. And meanwhile, Biden's just sending pallets of money around the world and stuff like that. And I'd be going, you got to help us here, Joe. Come on, don't do this. So I don't think Powell has an allegiance to Biden, that some people assume he's just a swamp creature and he'll do whatever he's told. I don't buy that model. Second of all, if I were Powell, I'd be sitting there going, look, when I'm done, the world's going to judge me, not the Federal Reserve, me, just like they did Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen, there's a post-it for you, and Powell. Do I want to be Arthur Burns or Paul Volcker? Do I want to be a hero? I think you get to middle age and you care about these things. It's legacy. It's like, why am I here?
He's talked a lot about his legacy. Right.
Howard Cosell, when he was dying, was asked, tell us about your career. And he said, it all seems so stupid. And I go, what? So Howard got to the point where his life seems stupid. And I said, try not to get there, Dave. Try to get to the point where you say, I did it my way. I followed a good path. Saving Private Ryan, final scene. Did I live a good life? Mm-hmm. I think Powell wants to be on Mount Rushmore with Volcker. If he doesn't, he is a douchebag, because I think someone in his position that should almost be number one. Mm-hmm. I think that's why Trump could surprise if he got another term, because I think he wants to be great. He's a narcissist. I've read books on narcissism just to understand that guy. Mm-hmm. But I think he figured out it's not about just putting his name on a plane and on a building. That's shallow narcissism. I think he weaponized narcissism and got to the point where he said, look, if I'm going to be one of the greats, I have to do some great things. And the America needs fixing. And if I fix it, I will be great. So I think he actually has a sense of calling. I'm hoping. This might just be optimism. Mm-hmm. Kamala does not, in my opinion. So I think Powell's got to have that. If he doesn't, he's wired so different than what I think a middle-aged man who's been successful would be thinking. Mm-hmm. It would be so outside of my experience. I got to the end. I've wrapped up my career. I wrote a review article that covered the 45 years I was a chemist, with a specific slice, a specific focus. But I took an overview. It's right now. It's in the hands of an editor looking at it. And it's kind of like, so what happened? 45 years later, what happened? Mm-hmm. What's the message, right? What would Howard Cosell say? I think Powell's going to do that. And the 50 basis points might have been, there was some problem, some flickering. He said, okay, I'll deal with that. Might have been a bone. It might be the beginning of a driving race to zero, at which point he's going to go and Mount Shitmore with Arthur Burns. Mm-hmm. But I don't think so. I wouldn't be surprised if he said, okay, I gave you a little bit of break. That's all you're getting. Mm-hmm. You're going to have to suck it up now.
Dave, when we think about the Fed chairs, and also, you were telling us about these people that don't understand valuations anymore. Do you think that a lot of this we can kind of chalk up to these super specialized career paths rather than being a bit more of a generalist and trying to understand widely instead of super deeply in one narrow focus?
Well, I think leaders, people in positions of leadership, are just renting now. So some guy like Jamie Dimon, as much as I could imagine him being a total douchebag, I think he does have ownership of JP Morgan. If you get charged with running some company that you weren't part of, that you didn't help build, and you didn't help, you don't have ownership. You just want those options. You got to stay in the job for enough years to get enough options to get stinking rich. And I think we've got an awful lot of those kind of renters. They're camping out for free inside these companies. The guy who started in the mailroom and become CEO is a distant memory. Mm-hmm. And so I think we got that problem. The government's so big now. At the turn of the century, the government was something like 3 or 4% of GDP. I might be quoting that number wrong. I might have gotten that in my head, and I could be dead wrong. But it was, put it this way, much smaller percent of GDP. How's that? Mm-hmm. The captains of industry, who were not averse to using children for slave labor and stuff like that, right? These guys were not sweethearts, but they paid politicians to get the hell out of the way, for the most part. The bribes were, don't give me any guff. Mm-hmm. I'm busy making cars. Nowadays, the bribes are to give me money. give me billions of dollars to make more Boeings. Give me money to build solar panels that otherwise are not cost effective and are probably negative energy return, cradle to grave analysis, which I talked to an energy security analyst, and he said, yes, they don't pay for themselves energetically. They're energetically negative. I'd like to talk to Doomberg and find out what his current view is on this. I should probably ask him. So now we've so financialized the system that no one seems to care about getting it right and taking sort of emotional possession of it. So the whole system is run by a bunch of 20-somethings in cubicles who are prairie dogging and who've never seen a bear market. To them, 2008 is history, and they will get the message soon. I think we're about to have our wake up call. And the BRICS story, what a great story that is. The BRICS is a gigantic geopolitical realignment. And I spent a couple hours on the phone with Steve Hanke, who's a currency expert, so he should have a currency-centered view. And I said, but this is not about a currency. This is about global alliances. And he said, you're absolutely right. So he agreed. And so the 25 BRICS countries are fundamentally important countries that are saying we are no longer hanging out with the United States. We're hanging out with so Michelle Macquarie Kitco asked me the other day about a BRICS meeting that's coming real soon, actually, where all the BRICS representatives are meeting in Russia to talk. And she said, how important is that? I said, you answered your question already. Mm-hmm. They're meeting in Russia. They're not meeting in Iceland. They're not meeting in Switzerland. They're meeting in Russia, right? This is the country that we've tried to demonize every step of the way. We've got 25 countries who are meeting in Russia. If you somehow think that means Putin's in trouble, you're dreaming. Mm-hmm. And I hear people, I got an argument yesterday with a guy who said Putin's in trouble and Russia's in trouble and the Ukrainians, it's great that they're fighting. I go, no. The Ukrainians are all dying. The war is almost over. And it was unnecessary. I'm confident NATO could have stopped the war. They wanted it. Mm-hmm. That's just sick, right? 500,000, 600,000 dead Ukrainians because we wanted to erode Russia's power. Let's erode Russia's power by sending Lindsey Graham over there. Putin will surrender if we send Lindsey Graham to Russia. Because they'll say, I'll quit. Just get Lindsey out of here. And McCain and Lindsey Graham, rallied the troops in Ukraine to get ready to fight Russia back in 2015 or 16, right? Proxy wars are pretty evil, right? They're wars where they say, look, we don't want to spill any blood, but we're happy to spill your blood. And so we've killed an estimated 4.5 to 5 million people in the Middle East since 9/11. You'd have a tough time justifying how 3,000 dead Americans generates 4.5 million dead everybody else, especially since you can't even identify who did 9/11. I'm a truther, so you really can't identify who did 9/11, in my opinion. I think the odds the United States knowingly did 9/11 is in the 90 percentile zone. I happily bet big money. I'd buy that before I bought NVIDIA. How's that? I'd bet on 9/11 being an inside job more than I'd bet on NVIDIA being a good investment.
At this point.
For quite a few years now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, NVIDIA might become cheap. NVIDIA dropped 95% back in 2000. They could do it again. Mm-hmm. And they have a history of running scams. A guy named Jack Gambles is talking about all the shell companies that are buying their chips from them and stuff like that. And the entire AI movement has not figured out how to monetize anything. So at some point, it's like, we're not going to support a $3 trillion company to make chips that don't make us any money. And people don't think China's going to come up with a chip. Taiwan's going to come up with another. By the way, I don't think NVIDIA makes its own chips. I think it's a Taiwanese company that makes the chips. Mm-hmm. Why is NVIDIA making all the money? I don't know. I don't understand the economics. So I'm ignorant, so I shouldn't talk about it. But NVIDIA will be the poster child. They will be the global crossing.
So Dave, going back to this idea of this 40-year bear market, is that why gold makes sense to you? Does it still make sense to you? And after this, significant rise that we've seen over the last year, does it make you want to trim any of those profits, or has your conviction in it become stronger?
My conviction is pretty high. I could imagine a scenario where gold is the world's reserve currency 10 years from now. So that would
part of it, at least.
Well, if the dollar is the reserve currency, then gold could be. BRICS is talking about a gold currency. People say, the BRICS currency would suck. I said, not if it's gold. If BRICS wants to issue a gold currency, all they have to do is print the shit and say, here it is. These are now worth gold. It's not like putting together the euro. It was this extraordinarily complicated process.
Yeah.
Because it was a fiat currency with all these different wacky countries all mixing together. Mm-hmm. A gold-based currency will take as long to put together as it takes to set up the printing presses and create the slip that says this piece of paper guarantees you 1/10 of an ounce of gold at your local bank. Mm-hmm. That's a phrase that system has already been developed in the past, right? So I'm optimistic about that. It's the lesser of evils, right? You want to own government debt while they're trying to inflate it away, which they're not doing successfully, right? So if the debt's rising 7% a year and GDP is rising, let's be optimistic and say 2.5%. I don't believe it, but 2.5%. Then we're losing ground. We're not inflating away any debt. Mm-hmm. And I actually think the inflation numbers are so bad that since the GDP has an inflation corrected inherent to it, that if you actually corrected correctly, that's a bad sentence, using either John Williams or Butowski's Chapwood Index or some legitimate metric for inflation, I think you can make the argument that the U.S. economy has been shrinking for years. We say, that can't be. And I go, what? Why? Mm-hmm. What immutable law of nature says that can't be? And they say, another one of these stupid ones, our economy is 70% consumption. What a dumb statement. You produce. I'm willing to give you service, providing service, because that can represent a worth. But the bottom line is consumption is what you do after you produce. If I don't grow the crops, I don't eat. If I don't make the cars, I don't get a car. And so you produce, and then the fruits of that labor become consumption. There's nothing about consumption that fits into the phrase gross domestic product. And guys like Schiff have been saying this for years, right? The United States is in charge of consuming. Mm-hmm. What kind of goofy situation is that? So that's kind of Triffin's dilemma, right? Triffin's dilemma says that being reserve currency is a suicide mission, and that you have to run a trade imbalance, and eventually your currency dies. Mm-hmm. And so I'm comfortable with gold. What also makes it easy, my cost basis of gold depends which ounce you look at, but it began at 270, and my silver cost basis was somewhere in the high threes.
Wow.
And I remember buying quite a bit up to 290. And then I remember when gold went over 300, 310, 320. And I had friends saying, you should sell now. And I white knuckled it. I remember buying it at 457. How do I remember this? Well, I had a deal with the local coin dealer where I'd say, look, you get a couple ounces, I'll bring cash down, I'll pay for it. Mm-hmm. So for 20 years, I took cash down to the local coin dealer and would take the ounces as they came in. And I paid spot for ounces of gold. That's pretty good, actually. And for ounces of silver. For eagles, I paid spot. That's real good. Mm-hmm. So one day I bought some at 457 and he said, don't you think this is the top? Knowing I'm going to buy it. So he's not trying to talk me out of it. Mm-hmm. I said, well, let me ask you this. How many people do you have who are buying gold from you? And he said, oh, about 4. And I said, and the other 3 are my friends, aren't they? He says, yeah, actually, now that I think about it. I said, does that seem like a mania top to you? Mm-hmm. Doesn't to me, right? If Dave and his 3 friends are the only ones trying to buy gold from you. And we haven't seen a blow off top. Silver did that march up to 49. I remember getting really enthusiastic and then getting pounded and going, oh, Dave, when your emotions start running like that, you should just shut your mouth. Even if you're going to hang on to it, just shut your mouth. So no. And then the question, what are you going to do? Buy U.S. debt? No. You're going to buy equities that are 150% overvalued? No. You're going to buy real estate? It doesn't feel like the right time for that one, right? Airbnbs are going on the market. Commercial real estate looks like it not only is in crash mode, but you can make the case that we're not going to need office buildings the way we did before. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to picture malls coming back. Strip malls are. I was talking to a book fair one day. He says, strip malls are going to do okay. And I remember thinking, why? Then he pointed out that what's a strip mall have? Well, unlike an enclosed mall, strip malls have dry cleaners, liquor stores, things like that. Those are useful. Mm-hmm. The mall has JCPenney, call that Amazon now, has, Hallmark cards, Joann's pretzels. It just doesn't have anything worth anything. So the malls are all dying. But the strip malls. So if we had a big sell-off, I think I'd find REITs that own strip malls and probably try to buy those on the cheap, maybe. Mm-hmm. My dad and I had a chat about real estate when I was in high school, and I remember it vividly, and it was so important. And I said, so let me see if I got this right, Dad. I said, if you bought real estate in the 30s, you got rich. And he said, yes, but no one had any money. Mm-hmm. Now, the fact I remember this conversation is pretty important. That became the message when I started investing again in earnest. I said, you got to have money at the bottom. Mm-hmm. When it goes on sale, you got to be cashed up, which means you have to be in cash at the top because you can't ride the thing down and get your ass kicked and then have money. Mm-hmm. And so you really have to be able to sit on cash when everybody else is partying like it's 1999. And that's painful. And I did that in 99 well. And I watched the NASDAQ go for another 9 months at least after I sold WorldCom for a 700% gain. I sold Dell for a 700% gain. I had a company called Tomer, which is a bottle recycling company, for about a 400% gain. Warner Lambert, Lipitor, I think was Warner Lambert. Oh, I thought I was a genius, but then I got scared of the markets. I sold them all. I put tight stops behind them. By mid-99, I was completely out. So the blind nut found a squirrel, and I started buying gold. There's a Y2K theme there. People say, well, then you were stupid. I go, no, Y2K was risk. The fact that it didn't pan out didn't mean it wasn't risk. Mm-hmm. Right? I wear a seatbelt because of risk. I didn't die. It wasn't a failure. I buy insurance because of risk. Mm-hmm. But I bought the gold. And then I remember one time we were at the top. We were at the pinnacle. And I was in a Pfizer at the end of a consulting gig. And the NASDAQ was over 5,000. And I said to them, the NASDAQ's going to go to triple digits. And they all laughed at me. It got to 1,100. I'm calling that a win, even though it didn't quite get to triple digits. But I'm talking to a guy who had a small startup that I was involved with, and he sold it to Mettler. And the president was out there buying Cisco and shit. Was right at the top. And I said, Alan, he was the VP. I said, Alan, do not dump your fucking money into the markets right now. Just don't do it. Just don't do it. And about a year later, I saw him in the markets and it started to tank and gold has started to go, but not really yet, not too seriously. And he said, you called it perfectly. I said, well, the script had been written before. This was not a new script. He says, what are you doing now? And I'm hesitating to tell him. And I said, I own a bit of a fuck ton of gold. And he goes, gold? I go, yeah, gold. And a couple years later, I ran into him. He says, I can't believe that gold call you made. So people say, gold was easy to buy because it was cheap.
I was going to say after making the call for the top in the markets, and then he didn't buy your conviction for gold at the bottom.
Right. So one time Chris Martenson said it well. He said, I have people say to me, well, it was easy to buy gold back then because it was so cheap. And we laughed. And I said, the response to that is, why it's cheap is because there was about 5 of us in the world who gave a shit about owning gold. No one liked gold. But I saw the turn, and if the podcast is still online somewhere, I'm on record, and that is long before I started blogging in any way. I was on Corlin Economics Report. Does that ring a bell?
Yep.
And they brought up gold, and I said, something's changed. And they said, what? And I said, well, you know how every time gold started to move, the Bank of England would announce they're going to sell it, and then it would tank. And then it would start to go up a little bit, and then they'd sell some and it would tank. And I said, recently, the Bank of England, the price of gold was going up, and the Bank of England announced they were going to sell gold, and it went up, not down. I said, and they just sold some the other day, and it went up, not down. This is probably 2001, if I've got my bottom straight. And they call it the brown bottom because he was selling Bank of England gold right down to the very bottom. Mm-hmm. And it has an off-color feel to it too. I like that part. And and that was the turn. And I go, something's changed here. There's some sort of static electricity in the air. And so I held on, and I held through 1900. And then when it hovered around 1200 for a long time, and the equities gave back all their gains. And I go, I knew those were a bunch of liars. I knew they were a bunch of liars. I ripped a couple of CEOs a new one at a meeting one day. I said, you guys fucked up so bad. And they admitted it. They said, yeah, they did all the forward selling crap and stuff they did because they didn't believe it either. And, but as it hovered around 1200 for a couple of years, I bought another wad. That was the last gold I bought. And so my cost basis is either 270 or 290 or 457 or in between up to 1200. Mm-hmm. So when the price goes up and down, I don't lose sleep.
Yeah.
Right. I said, shucks. Yeah. It's like, Max Kaiser. He doesn't worry when Bitcoin goes up and down because either way, I think he's a billionaire.
Mm-hmm. So why platinum?
1 versus 2 bad.
Oh,
platinum's a problem. Platinum. I got into the platinum because of platinum miners. They look dirt cheap. I saw a 100-click YouTube. That's not exactly high visibility YouTube. But the guy went to the balance sheet of a couple of the platinum miners. And if you look at them, they're dirt cheap by any metric on absolute scales with money, cash on the balance sheet and dividends and everything about them. And they're all in South Africa. So I bought some of them. Not enough to get crushed, even if they got crushed. But how do you get crushed off a PE of 5 with a dividend of 9, right? I mean, that doesn't seem very scary. Well, the mistake I may have made, and I think the really good bet is that the death of the internal combustion engine is premature. I think a Mark Twain theft of a kind of a Mark Twain idea. Electric cars don't work that well, and I'm told hybrids use quite a bit of platinum. and so I think we're going to have catalytic converters with platinum in them for a very long time. And so I think the world's platinum supply I'm told, is shrinking. I say told because who knows what's the fact? Who knows who to believe? Mm-hmm. The problem is my exposure to platinum is the miners. I should have known better. But platinum hasn't gone anywhere either. South Africa is not stable. South Africa, the white farmers are getting slaughtered.
I was there last year at this time.
And what was your sense? Was it seem normal? Was there an edginess? What did you sense?
My sense was that this place is on the downslope rather than the upslope. And I think you're exactly right. You know, the power intermittency issues and
Australia has a problem too.
Okay.
Australia has power problems too.
I haven't been to Australia. I had a trip booked to go, and I had a bunch of.
You travel a lot. I'm going to get some coffee. I'm still hearing you. Don't worry about my rudeness.
I do. I think travel is extremely important. I'm actually heading to Argentina in just under a month here. But I had a trip booked to go to Australia, and I had a bunch of shit stolen, like $50,000 worth of tools, and almost took my livelihood away, basically. And so I canceled my trip. But anyway, last year had the privilege of going to South Africa with actually Francis Hunt, the market sniper.
Oh yeah, I did a podcast with him. That was an interesting. Francis is a pistol.
Mm-hmm. But we actually did a motorcycle trip from Joburg up through Botswana and into Zimbabwe up to Victoria Falls.
You're a regular when you call it Joburg.
And then when we got back, we drove from Joburg down to Cape Town. And one of the biggest things that struck me was this idea, there's a fairly new, fairly good shape highway as you're going through Joburg. And all of a sudden, the lights go out. And I'm just noticing odd things like this. Like literally the street lights are just gone. And there's traffic lights in different parts of this town that are just gone.
So they've been destroyed by looters and things like that?
Well,
rot.
The crazy thing is that when, like, now that people know the power intermittency schedule, they just go take this stuff and they strip it for copper or strip it for material, whatever they do with it. Right. And then they also stand at where the traffic light was and try to charge you to go through the intersection. Like it's utter chaos.
Oh, so I really should probably dump those platinum miners completely based on that.
But that's the thing.
They will take those mines eventually.
Mm-hmm. But again, like if you really want to be a contrarian, you can look at that on the other hand and say, well, that's what makes them even more valuable, because where else are you getting this platinum for that's going to be absolutely critical? Well,
but the bull case then is for platinum itself, because it could become very hard to mine platinum, and therefore the world's platinum supply is all you get.
Yeah.
I think Russia puts out a little platinum, but I think so. It really, and who's Mitch Fierstein.
Okay.
I've had numerous chats with him. It's been a while, actually. I should call him. And he was saying, buy platinum. And I said, I had some platinum miners. He said, no, buy platinum. And so he was a platinum bull, and it hasn't panned out yet. So Mitch, if Early's wrong, Mitch is wrong, but I don't buy the Early's wrong argument. If you eventually are right in a big way, right? When the broken clock is right twice a day, when that clock is right, your house blows up, you should be paying attention to what time it is. And he was saying buy platinum. And then I was talking to Einhorn, who has somehow adopted me. And he said, you're the second person to tell me I should look at platinum. If the guys in his league start buying platinum, they could actually dent the market, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But right now, it's been dead money for 15 years easily, right? And I think the fear of the internal combustion engine going the way of the dodo bird is keeping it down, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Through that idea of, dead money and, let's say, opportunity cost, do you think that still applies to gold miners? Like, you and I have had this conversation probably several times.
I'm just so despondent. So what gold miners do I buy? I buy the gold miners that Bill Fleckenstein and Fred Hickey tell me to buy. Mm-hmm. And there's about 3 of them. So I own a couple of gold miners. They're irrelevant. West Dome. I barely know their names. I know their symbols. I think Imperial or something. I don't know. I'd have to boot up I don't own enough to care enough to remember the details. I have them there in case they start flickering in some weird way, and I go, okay, something's happening. So it's more of a post-it on my screen than an investment. I bought about $40,000 worth of a small cap stock, Prophase, PRPH, because a friend of mine knows the CEO, and he also owns the friend owns 6% of the company. And he says they're rocking. At some point, the world's going to notice. And so I said, okay, on a whim, I own that. But again, I could get crushed. It's been disappointing. I thought something would happen, but I got my start in serious sort of paying attention to the markets in the mid-90s when a friend of mine who was a traveling salesman for pharma, he would go to pharma, and he loved to talk stocks. And it turns out that the more he traveled, the more he knew about companies, the more the executives wanted to go to lunch with him, the more he would learn about companies. Mm-hmm. And he was the one who said, buy this bandwidth company down in Mississippi. It's going to be big. It's called LDDS. And so on a whim, I had a kind of a dormant IRA that I wasn't paying attention to. And so I dumped a bunch into LDDS. That became WorldCom 700% later. And he got me into Warner Lambert, actually. I discovered Tomra, the bottle recycling company. But that was during a period when everyone could make money, right? If you were in the 90s, if you weren't making money, you were just a moron. You're shorting is what you were probably doing. So you're not a moron. You were just you were the last short standing. The fact there's no short sellers left is a problem, right? That really tells you. When I do podcasts, I read the comments, and the comments seem to tell me we're close to a top. Where, this guy's been calling a top for 3 years. He's just full of shit. And I go, a guy who calls a top for 3 years, that's a blip. Mm-hmm. That's a blip. If you think 3 years is an insufferably long period of time to be wrong, you're in the wrong business, in my opinion. You are about to become a statistic. I miss the entire teens. It doesn't bother me. My best decade ever was the noughts. My worst decade was the teens. I made about 4% during the teens. I made 4% compounded, annualized 4%. The noughts, I made 13% compounded. Now think about what was happening to everyone else in the world during the noughts. 2 big bear markets. They were getting death by bongo. Mm-hmm. And I'm compounding at 13%. So you don't have to have too many decades like that to end up okay. Mm-hmm. One more decade. I want one more decade of victory. But I'm way the fuck up this year. I'm like up 30% this year. I've been treated well. And so I don't need even many of those if you can hang on to it, right? But that hanging on to it part is tough. So what do I think? I think we're going to correct hard. The way you correct is you correct price and you correct investor attitudes. And it's been 40 years since we really corrected both. Mm-hmm. Correct, especially the investor attitudes. Investors now still believe that no matter what, as long as you hang on, you'll be fine.
Yeah.
And history shows that's not right. Mm-hmm. there are times where owning the top is fatal for the rest of your life. Just ask Japanese investors about the 1989 top. If you own the markets in 1906, inflation corrected, you were even in 1981. If you're trading, you could do fine. Mm-hmm. But inflation adjusted. Here's the other one for you. And I probably already told you this, but senility helps me pretend like I didn't. Ron Grice of the Chart Store sends me charts that I think he's published too. But if you take the market from 1925 to the present, S&P, and you correct for inflation, not using the CPI, which I'm sure we agree is bullshit. Instead, you correct for the M2 money supply, which seems like a pretty clean way to correct for inflation, mm-hmm. since they say it's a monetary phenomenon. The market goes down. From 1925 to the present, the market goes down, corrected for M2. The other thing it's not corrected for, by the way, is per capita. So in the United States, the market price value was servicing 1/4 the number of people that it is now in the United States. It also is servicing a far bigger number because of foreign investors who've gotten into it. So you say, oh, here's how big the pie has gotten. And you go, but that pie is feeding billions now. And therefore, it's been bid up to ridiculous nosebleed levels because more and more people want a slice of that pie. And so what would bring it back to earth? Well, panic, mayhem, shitty economies, demographics suck in most of the countries. Mm-hmm. By the way, here's one for you. Everyone says that your economy is not healthy unless your populace is growing, right? The demographic model seems accepted by all. That's a fundamental problem. And the reason it's a fundamental problem is because what I just described as a Ponzi scheme. If you have to bring in new entrants, like in some Amway company, and the only way it's going to work is if you bring more and more new entrants. That is the definition of a Ponzi scheme. Mm-hmm. So this idea that we need immigrants to pay for people who are already here, that's a Ponzi scheme.
I did a podcast based around demographics, and it's something that I think too few people take into account when making these mental models, when thinking about all of this stuff and really projecting decades out.
Well, yeah, Lacey Hunt corrects for per capita. One day I sent him an email and said, I like the fact you correct for per capita. Mm-hmm. And he said in his dry way, he said, well, everyone should. I go, yeah, I know, but they don't. I noticed Lacey's always very grounded. And he says things very matter-of-factly. He says, well, it's almost dryly. And I noticed in the last couple of interviews he did, he sounded a little apoplectic. He sounded troubled, where instead of saying, well, we're just going to go through this period of this and correct for that, and it was more like, well, that won't work because, and this won't work because. So there was a real sort of, I don't see a way out here. And I sent him an email and I said, I've watched a lot of your podcasts. Last couple ones, I hear a more dire mood. I hear a sense of being unclear as to how we get out of this one. Mm-hmm. And his response was, "You would be correct. My wife is insisting that I take a vacation." Yeah, that'd probably be a good idea. Get away.
Get away. Yeah, no kidding.
Just put some distance between you and the pain. Mm-hmm. I think we're heading for a decade of problems. And we'll go through the valley of death. The only way out is the other side, mm-hmm. right? There's no backing out. And I think, I tend to think you don't inflate away debt, because to inflate, you have to create money. That money is debt-based money. So there's a paradox even in the idea of inflating away debt. And unless you purely monetize it, and that might get politically tricky next time. Mm-hmm. And that means eventually, I think at the end, there's a deflation. And those who own assets win, and those who have financialized worth won't. They'll lose. The people who have stuff that's purely worth something because the piece of paper says so. Mm-hmm. And so gold, platinum, companies that have a real revenue stream, companies that produce things. I'm going to Switzerland in May to give a talk at Tony Deaton's 40th anniversary of his Edelweiss holdings. And he made an offer I couldn't refuse. He said, I will pay for you and your wife to come. My wife has health problems. He says, I will hire her a private duty nurse if you need it. He says, you have to come. So I'm going there. I'm not sure she's coming with me, but it's in the Alps. It'll be fun.
It should be interesting.
I don't like traveling, but it's only 47 minutes drive from Zurich Airport. So it's an easy trek. And so it's like 12 hours to Zurich from here and another 45 minutes to his chateau. Mm-hmm. And I'll get to join up again with guys like Simon Mikhailovic and stuff like that.
Great guy. I've had some chats with him.
Yeah, I once drove to New York City to spend the afternoon for no other reason than to just chat with Simon and Grant Williams. Grant was down there with Simon and said, why don't you come down? And so I just hopped in the car down to New York City and we sat around chewing the fat in Simon's apartment. Mm-hmm. And he relayed the story of how he figured out that he needed a gold holding company when he found himself standing on a street corner, I think it was in Zurich, with a suitcase full of gold because he had to empty some box of gold. For some reason, like, we're closing it up, come get your gold. And you realize there's got to be a better way than this. And so he set up his holding company, which is a pretty good design, actually.
Dave, you mentioned that you read a lot of comments when you do a podcast. Do you find that to be instructive in any way, shape, or form other than just understanding, let's say, market tone?
Once in a while, someone will say something useful. Once in a while, someone will say something that reminds me, stop doing that. Mm-hmm. There's total absurdity. Like I'll do podcasts I find that they go anywhere from 90-10 to 50-50 in terms of the discussions. Different podcasters have different rhythms. Guys like Mike Ferris, for example, is happy to just sit back and you talk. And then once in a while, he'll stick something in. And then others want to have a conversation. Mm-hmm. I see the most insane thing where I'll see someone like Adam Taggart, who I think does great podcasts. And I'll see comments like, why doesn't Adam shut up and let the speaker talk? And I go, are you watching the same podcast as me? So sometimes the other thing I've noticed is there seems to be waves of negatives that show up. I get the feeling I must have said the election's rigged. Boom, 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 boom. Out come the negative comments. I think some algo's picking up on it. Mm-hmm. And then I listen to what seems to connect. I hear people say, well, something about valuation that tells me they still don't understand it. And so I go, I've got to find a better way to convey it. Mm-hmm. Feeds the narcissist in me a little bit. It tells me about sentiment, as you pointed out. When there's a lot of people in the comment section talking about what a fool this is, he should have just bought NVIDIA. That tells me that the top is nigh. Mm-hmm. And then soon I will have to stop defending my anti-NVIDIA position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find constructive, good criticism is hard to come by.
Rare.
Very rare.
Yeah.
And
I think it's more one of these where you lick your finger and put your finger on. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you just get a sense of sentiment. You get all sorts of flattering, great video stuff. That doesn't tell you anything. I'm happy to get it. But once in a while, someone says something where you go, they understood. They got it. Mm-hmm. That person picked up on the theme. But that's where I figured out people don't understand valuations.
Mhm.
Their comments on there and on Twitter about valuations, I go, that's not what valuation is. It's not a price. It's a valuation. Right. And I'll say, okay, if you want to let the valuations be twice their norm, that's fine, but you got to expect half the return. It just doesn't, that's the way it works. The two are inversely correlated. And, I'd rather buy a stock that's got a PE of 5 than one that has a PE of 500. Appreciation pulled forward is not a good thing.
Yeah. All right, Dave. Well, I think we've solved enough of the world's problems today, or at least analyzed them. Is there anything that you'd like to leave the audience with to think about before we wrap up?
If you have college-age kids, pay attention to what they're doing. If you have pre-college age kids, pay attention. The educational system is rotting a little bit. And that's not a statement about Cornell. I think Cornell is a very good school. I think it's impressive, actually. But I think we're going to see a real washing out of colleges as people realize that somehow $250,000 to go to college to get a degree that gets you a $30,000 job is not well spent money.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would love to see the system go back to an apprenticeship system, a trade training, teach a guy not only how to, put up stud walls and stuff, but teach him accounting, right? Teach him what it takes to actually build a company that builds houses, things like that. I think we're going to go back to that. I think we're going to go back to people who can make shit and do shit that's valuable, plumbers, things like that. There's so many college degrees that it will never be paid off. I've got a funding plan for college that I've heard elsewhere since I first came up with it. Might have existed before I came up with it, but came out of my skull for me. And that is that you sell a tranche of like $100 million debt to pay for Cornell student loans. And the payment is a percentage of their annual salary for the next 10 or 15 years. And let the free market determine how valuable that is. So a place like Cornell, you might say, okay, I'll take 5% or I'll take 10%, whatever you do the math, the free market will. Mm-hmm. And I first presented that to Lauren Lister. Remember Lauren Lister, Capital Accounts, Dimitri Kofinas back then? Years ago. Dimitri Kofinas was Lauren's producer and boyfriend. I presented to her. She said, what about different majors? And I said, no, kids change majors. Just do it for the college. And so a tranche of debt from Stanford you're going to get a better rate on the loan, borrowing money, than from Bennington College. And what would happen is that the free market would determine which colleges just aren't worth going to. Right. Now, it will fail. And the reason it will fail is because someone will say, oh, you're being racist because you're supporting white elite colleges, and that these other colleges who are training minorities and stuff can't survive. And I would say if you want to play that game, then find another way to supplement. I still think the model's a good one. Mm-hmm. And it also gets you out from underneath the student debt without letting you default out. So the reason they put in the you can't default is because kids were declaring bankruptcy at 22. And that's not good either. And so if you say, look, you are committing, you're an indentured servant for a percentage of your salary for 10 or 15 years. Mm-hmm. Make the call. And I think if we cut the number of colleges in half, we would be better off. And there's certain demographics of colleges that would go fast, the private schools that aren't very good. I think community colleges should be elevated. I think they do well. I think trade schools and things like that. I think elite colleges are fine, but don't send your kid off to Harvard and let him major in gender studies. Mm-hmm. Well, you can, but it's going to be a waste of money. Although, that could be the big industry, right? Could be. There's just a huge demand for people to be experts at gender studies.
Only time will tell, Dave.
Only time will tell.
Yeah. Of course, Dave, excellent Twitter follow at David B. Collum. And you're pretty much available on every single podcast everywhere. I can't believe the number that you do. You said you're doing one a day right now, but there's got to be some reason for that. Yeah.
Yeah, I fill time and space. I asked Grok. I'm going to put it in my year in review. I asked Grok to describe my Twitter feed. It was such an entertaining write-up. It was so funny. And there was truth. I mean, I'm going, well, I think it's designed to be flattering. But it was funnier than shit too. I go, that is so correct. That is so on the money.
How long was it?
It was probably about a page.
Okay.
And it talks about how I insert. They said something like, imagine a stand-up comic does whatever, and they said, and he doesn't avoid controversial topics, and at the same time is always, inserting, off-color humor and, shit like that. But there was some funny lines in it. I can't remember them, but I'm gonna use it to introduce in the introduction of my year in review. I'm gonna repost it and say, this is why you should follow me on Twitter.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Excellent, Dave. Well, as always, I really appreciate your time and the chat, sir.
Adios. It was fun.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.